22 years old. That's how old I am, and I'm pretty sure I'm about to die on my own kitchen floor. My arm is broken. Actually broken. Not sprained, not bruised, broken. I heard the snap, felt the bones shift under my skin. The pain is so massive, so all-consuming, that my body doesn't even know how to process it. I keep waiting to pass out, but my stupid brain won't let me. It wants me to feel every single second of this. I'm lying on the cold tile floor of the apartment I used to think was mine. White cabinets above me. Stainless steel refrigerator to my left. Everything looks so normal, so aggressively domestic, except for the fact that my left forearm is bent at an angle that makes me want to throw up every time I look at it. My pona is in my rechthand. My good hand. The one that still works. I'm texting my mom through tears that blur the screen so badly I can barely see the letters. My fingers are shaking, full-body tremors that won't stop, like I'm standing outside in a blizzard instead of lying on heated floors in a luxury high-rise. I type the words, "Mom, he broke my arm." I hit send without checking the number. Because Caleb cornered me again. My alpha boyfriend. No ex-boyfriend. The alpha who loved me as long as I behaved, as long as I was pretty and quiet and grateful, as long I didn't ask questions or have opinions or want things that weren't about him. This morning, I told him I couldn't do this anymore. 3 years. 3 years of walking on eggshells, of suppressing my scent when I was upset because he hated when I smelled like fear, of letting him track my phone and read my messages and tell me what to wear and who to talk to. I'm leaving, Caleb. He'd smiled. That's what I keep coming back to. He smiled. Then he grabbed my wrist. Twisted it. Hard. Harder than anything I've ever felt. The snap echoed through the kitchen. I heard it, he heard it too. And then the pain hit, and I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything except collapse and scream. Eli, he whispered, leaning close enough that his breath ghosted across my cheek, warm and foul like rotting flowers. You're not going anywhere. He said it so gently, like he was telling me he loved me. I collapsed completely. The pain was white-hot, shooting up my arm in waves that made my vision swim and my stomach heave. I think I might have vomited. I'm not sure. Everything after the snap is fuzzy around the edges, like a dream I can't quite remember. But Caleb just stood there, hands in his pockets, looking down at me like I was a mess he didn't feel like cleaning up. He locked the door behind him and left me on the floor, left me writhing in agony, left me with a broken arm and a locked door and absolutely no way to get help. That was 3 hours ago. 3 hours of lying here, watching the light from the window shift across the floor. 3 hours of the pain not getting better, not even a little bit, just settling into a constant, throbbing pulse that makes me nauseous and dizzy and desperate. I managed to pull out my phone with my good hand maybe an hour ago. Maybe 2. Time doesn't make sense anymore. My fingers trembled so badly I could barely type, but I forced the message out to my mom. Begged her to come. Told her what he did. Then the pain became too much, and I put the phone down, and I lay there on the cold hardwood floor, convinced that Mom would come. That she'd burst through the door with her concerned omega scent and her soft hands, and she'd make it better. She always made it better when I was a kid. But nobody came. Hours dragged by. The sun moved across the floor. Shadows grew long. My arm throbbed, a relentless drumbeat of agony that made it impossible to think about anything else. I checked my phone again with blurry vision, squinting at the screen through tears I couldn't stop. And my blood ran cold. The number was wrong. I hadn't texted Mom. I'd texted someone else entirely. Some random number I'd never seen before. Probably some stranger who thought I was insane or pranking them, or worse, some stranger who'd just delete the message and go back to their life, leaving me here to die alone on my kitchen floor. Panic clawed at my chest, sharp and suffocating. Couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Couldn't do anything except stare at that wrong number and realize that no one was coming. No one knew. No one cared. Mom wasn't coming. No one was coming. I was going to die here. But then, the doorbell rang. I stared at the door from where I lay, crumpled on the floor, my broken arm cradled against my chest like a wounded animal. Every instinct screamed danger. What if it was Caleb coming back? What if he'd changed his mind about leaving me alive? What if he'd come to finish what he started? But what choice did I have? I couldn't stay here forever. Couldn't just bleed out on my own apartment floor because I was too scared to answer the door. So I crawled. Every movement was torture. My arms screamed with each shift of weight, each drag of my body across the floor. Sweat poured down my face. My breath came in ragged gasps. By the time I reached the door, I was shaking so badly I could barely reach the lock. The doorbell rang again. Just a minute, I tried to say, but it came out as a croak, barely audible even to my own ears. I managed to unlock it with shaking fingers, pulled it open, collapsed against the doorframe, and there he was, an alpha, tall, easily over 6 feet, dark hair that looked like he'd run his hands through it too many times, all messy and disheveled in a way that somehow made him look more put together, not less. A jawline sharp enough to cut glass. Broad shoulders that filled out his black t-shirt in a way that made my omega hindbrain sit up and pay attention despite everything. But it was his eyes that caught me. Stormy gray. Intense and focused, like he was trying to solve a puzzle just by looking at me. Like I was a math problem he was determined to figure out. He smelled like pine and rain and something darker underneath, something warm like cedar or leather or... I couldn't place it. But it was good. So good. Nothing like Caleb's aggressive musk that always made me feel trapped and small. "Are you Eli?" he asked. His voice was deep but surprisingly gentle. Careful. Like he was approaching a wounded animal and didn't want to scare me further. I stared at him, blinked, tried to make my brain work through the fog of pain and fear and confusion. "Why," I stammered, barely able to form words. "Who are you?" "Declan," he said quietly, like he didn't want to startle me. "You texted me." "Wrong number." But I tracked the location through emergency services when I realized it wasn't a prank. His gaze dropped to my arm, to the way I was cradling it, to the unnatural angle that no amount of hiding could disguise, and I watched his jaw tighten. A muscle jumped beneath his skin. His scent shifted, the pine and cedar sharpening with something that smelled like anger, but not at me. Never at me. "We need to get you to a hospital," he said. Right now. I wanted to protest. Wanted to say I was fine, that I could handle this myself, that I didn't need help from a complete stranger. But the pain was too overwhelming, and when Declan carefully, so carefully, helped me to my feet, I didn't resist. His hand was warm on my back, steadying. His scent wrapped around me, calming something deep in my chest that had been wound tight for years. He supported most of my weight as we made our way to his car, moving slowly so he wouldn't jostle my injured arm. Every few steps he glanced at me, checking, making sure I was still conscious, still breathing. "Almost there," he murmured. "You're doing good." The ride to the hospital was quiet. Declan kept his eyes on the road, focused and efficient, but every so often his gaze would flick to me in the passenger seat, assessing. I sat there with my broken arm in my lap, staring out the window at the city lights blurring past, and tried to remember the last time someone looked at me like that. Like I mattered. Like my pain mattered. I couldn't remember. The hospital was a blur of white coats and concerned faces and fluorescent lights that burned my eyes. Doctors examined my arm, took x-rays, confirmed what I already knew. It was fractured. Clean break, they said. They'd have to set it, put it in a cast, monitor for nerve damage. Through it all, Declan waited. He didn't leave. Didn't go sit in the waiting room like a normal person who'd done their good deed for the day. He stayed right there, leaning against the wall of the exam room, watching everything with those stormy gray eyes. When they set my arm, when I screamed, when tears streamed down my face, when I couldn't breathe through the pain, he was there. He didn't touch me, didn't crowd me, but his scent wrapped around me like a blanket, pine and cedar and something warm, and somehow that helped more than any of the painkillers they'd given me. Finally, I was stable, settled into a hospital bed with my arm in a bright blue cast and painkillers flowing through my fore. The world was soft around the edges, dreamlike, but I was still awake enough to know that Declan was still here. He pulled a chair close to my bed and sat down, leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, his gray eyes fixed on my face. "Who did this to you?" he asked. I looked away, focused on the pale green wall instead of his intense gaze. The paint had a scuff mark near the ceiling, right where it met the white trim. I wondered how long it had been there. Wondered if anyone had ever bothered to fix it. "No one," I said. "Eli." His voice was firm now. Not harsh. I don't think he knew how to be harsh, but leaving no room for deflection. "If someone hurts you, the police need to know. This isn't something you can ignore." "No." The word came out too fast, too desperate. I heard it and winced. Declan's eyes narrowed slightly, reading between the lines of my panic. "You're scared," he observed. It wasn't a question. I couldn't answer. Because if I told him about Caleb, if I explained that my ex-boyfriend had done this, in a fit of possessive rage, because I dared to try to leave him, then Caleb would never let me go. He'd find me wherever I went. He'd make sure I paid for betraying him. "Eli." Declan sighed and leaned back in the chair, ran a hand through his dark hair, making it even messier. "I'm not going to force you to talk, but I'm not leaving you alone." "Why?" I asked, genuinely confused and more than a little suspicious. Strangers didn't just drop everything to help someone they'd never met. Alphas certainly didn't. In my experience, alphas took. They didn't give. "You don't even know me." "I know you're hurt," he said simply. "I know you texted me by accident. I know you need help." That's enough. He leaned forward again, resting his elbows on his knees, and the intensity in his gaze made my breath catch. "Because if I leave, he'll come back. Won't he?" Tears burned behind my eyes. Because he was right. Caleb will come back. He always came back. He told me 100 times that I belonged to him, that I could never escape, that he'd find me wherever I tried to hide. He meant it. Every time he said it, I could see in his eyes that he believed it completely. Declan's expression softened when he saw my reaction. His scent shifted again, the sharp edges smoothing out into something warmer, something that smelled almost like comfort. "You need somewhere safe," he said. "I'm offering you that. I have an extra room in my apartment. You can stay there until we figure out a real plan to keep you protected." "You're serious?" I whispered, hardly daring to believe it. I wanted to say no. Every rational part of my brain screamed that this was a bad idea, that I shouldn't trust a stranger, that there had to be a catch. But then Caleb's face flashed through my mind. That smile he'd worn when he'd snapped my wrist like a twig. The way he'd whispered, "You're not going anywhere," like it was a promise and a threat all at once. And suddenly, Declan's offer felt like the only lifeline I had. "Okay," I whispered. The word was barely audible. Declan nodded once. Decisive. "I'll handle the discharge paperwork. Rest for now." As he left the room, I stared at the ceiling and wondered what I just agreed to. But beneath the fear and uncertainty, there was something else. Something that felt almost like hope. Declan's apartment was nothing like I expected. After the hospital discharged me, after Declan signed papers I barely glanced at and helped me into his car with that same careful, steadying touch, he drove us to a part of the city I'd never been to before. Not the luxury high-rises where Caleb had kept me. Not the trendy neighborhoods with their overpriced coffee shops and rooftop bars. This was different. The building was older, brick and character, with a small garden out front that someone clearly took pride in. The lobby smelled like lemon polish and old books, and the elevator had to be coaxed into moving with a firm press of the button. "It's not fancy," Declan said as the elevator groaned its way upward. "But it's safe. Good locks. Neighbors who mind their own business. It's perfect," I said and meant it. His apartment was on the 4th floor. Small but carefully kept, warm wood floors, bookshelves overflowing with well-worn paperbacks, a couch that looked comfortable enough to sleep on. Everything about it felt lived in and loved, like a home rather than a showpiece. There were plants everywhere, ferns and succulents, and a massive monstera in the corner that had grown so large it touched the ceiling. The kitchen was tiny but organized, with a kettle on the stove and mugs hanging from hooks above the counter. Declan led me to the guest room, a small space with a bed that looked incredibly soft, a window that overlooked the garden below, and a quilt on the wall that someone had clearly made by hand. "Bathrooms across the hall," he said, pausing in the doorway. "Towels are in the closet. Take all the time you need." Declan. He stopped, turned to look at me. "Why are you doing this?" I asked. "You don't know me. I could be anyone. I could be dangerous." Something flickered across his face. "Pain, maybe. Or memory." "A few years ago," he said slowly, "someone I cared about needed help. I didn't give it to her. I was too busy, too wrapped up in my own life to see what was happening right in front of me." His jaw tightened. "She didn't make it." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and raw. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I'm not telling you this for sympathy." He shook his head. "I'm telling you because I need you to understand. I'm not doing this because I'm a good person. I'm doing this because I already failed once, and I won't do it again." He held my gaze for a long moment. "You're safe here, Eli. I promise." Then he left, closing the door softly behind him. I stood there for a long time, staring at the closed door, trying to process everything. The alpha I'd texted by accident, the one who'd every right to ignore me, to delete my message and go back to his life, had tracked me down, taken me to the hospital, and brought me to his home. Because he didn't want to fail again. I didn't know what to do with that. I didn't know what to do with someone who helped without wanting anything in return. I lay down on the bed. The sheets smelled like lavender, not like alpha musk, which was somehow both a relief and a strange disappointment, and stared at the ceiling. My arm throbbed despite the painkillers. My body ached in ways that had nothing to do with my broken bone. And beneath all of it, beneath the fear and the exhaustion and the confusion, there was something I hadn't felt in years. Safety. The first few days were strange. Declan gave me space, more space than I knew what to do with. He'd leave for work in the morning, a cup of coffee waiting for me on the kitchen counter, a note with his phone number, and the words "call if you need anything" taped to the fridge. He'd come home in the evening, check on me, make dinner, and then retreat to his room or the living room, always giving me the option to be alone. He never pushed, never asked questions I wasn't ready to answer, never tried to touch me or crowd me or claim space in a way that made me feel trapped. It was disorienting. I'd spent 3 years with an alpha who took whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted it, who didn't understand the word no, who treated my body like it belonged to him, my time like it was his to command, my entire existence like I was just an extension of his will. And now here was this alpha, this stranger, who made me coffee and kept his distance and looked at me with those stormy gray eyes like he was waiting for me to set the pace. I didn't know how to handle it. On the third day, I finally left the guest room. Not because I wanted to, I've been perfectly content to hide in there forever, thanks, but because I could smell something amazing coming from the kitchen, and my stomach had decided that hiding was less important than eating. Declan was at the stove, wearing an apron that said "Kiss the Cook" in faded letters, stirring something in a large pot. He glanced up when I walked in and smiled, a small, easy smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Hungry. Starving, I admitted. He nodded toward the table, where 2 bowls were already set out. "Sit." "It's almost ready." I sat, watched him move around the kitchen with an ease that spoke of practice. He wasn't a natural cook. I could tell by the way he checked the recipe on his phone every few minutes, by the way he muttered under his breath when he added too much salt. But he was trying. He was trying. For me. "Declan." "Yeah. Thank you." He looked over his shoulder at me, and something in his expression softened. "You don't have to thank me, Eli. I know. That's why I'm doing it." He held my gaze for a moment longer than necessary, then turned back to the stove. But I saw the way his ears went pink at the tips, and I couldn't help the small smile that tugged at my mouth. The soup was good. Really good. We ate in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that didn't feel heavy or awkward, just peaceful. When we finished, Declan cleared the dishes while I sat there with my casted arm propped on a pillow, feeling useless. I can help, I said. I'm not completely broken. You're recovering, he corrected. There's a difference. He said it so matter-of-factly, like it was obvious, like of course he wouldn't expect me to do dishes with a broken arm. I stared at him. What? He asked, catching my look. Nothing. I shook my head. I'm not used to this. Used to what? Someone being nice. Without wanting something. Declan set down the dish he'd been drying. Turned to face me fully. Eli, I need you to understand something. His voice was quiet but serious. I'm not helping you because I expect something in return. I'm not helping you because I want to, he hesitated, claim you or control you or whatever your ex did. I'm helping you because you needed help and I could give it. That's it. That's all. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But 3 years with Caleb had taught me that alphas always wanted something. That every kindness came with a price tag. That the moment you let your guard down, they take whatever they wanted and leave you with nothing. I know it's hard to trust, Declan said, like he could read my thoughts. I'm not asking you to. I'm just asking you to stay. To rest. To let yourself heal. He picked up the dish towel again. Everything else can wait. The days blurred together after that. A week passed. Then 2. My arm healed slowly. The doctors said it would be at least 6 weeks before the cast came off, but the rest of me healed faster. The bruises faded. The nightmares came less frequently. I stopped jumping at every sound, stopped expecting Caleb to appear around every corner. Declan and I fell into a routine. Mornings, he'd make coffee before work. I'd sit at the kitchen table with my laptop, trying to find freelance design work to keep myself busy. Afternoons, I'd explore his apartment, his books, his records, the photo albums on his shelf that showed a younger Declan with a girl who looked like him, laughing at something off camera. His sister, I realized. The one he couldn't save. Evenings were the best. Declan would come home, loosening his tie, looking tired but always managing a smile when he saw me. We'd make dinner together, or rather he'd make dinner while I sat on the counter and gave unhelpful commentary, and then we'd watch something on his old couch. He never tried to sit too close. Never pushed for physical contact. But sometimes, when we were watching a movie and I was half asleep, I'd catch him looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Something soft. Something careful. Something that made my omega hindbrain purr with contentment. On the 15th day, I asked him about the girl in the photos. That's Lily, he said. His voice was steady, but I could smell the grief underneath. My little sister. She's beautiful. She was. He swallowed. She was 20 when she died. 20 years old, and she had her whole life ahead of her. And she died because she fell in love with the wrong alpha? My heart clenched. What happened? Declan was quiet for a long moment. The evening light slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. His name was Marcus. He seemed perfect at first. Charming, successful, attentive. Lily was head over heels. But little by little, things changed. He started isolating her from her friends. Then from me. He'd get angry when she talked to other alphas, even at work. He'd track her phone, read her messages, show up at places she hadn't told him about. His hands were clenched into fists on his knees. I saw it happening. I knew something was wrong. But I was busy with work, and Lily kept telling me she was fine, and he broke off. Took a breath. I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere. That she was an adult. That she'd ask for help if she needed it. She never asked, I said quietly. She never got the chance. His voice was barely above a whisper. One night, Marcus went too far. He hit her, and she fell, and she hit her head in the corner of their coffee table. By the time I got there, by the time anyone got there, it was too late. I reached out without thinking, took his hand. His fingers were warm, calloused, and they curled around mine like they belonged there. "I'm sorry," I said. That's not fair. That shouldn't have happened." "No," he agreed. "It shouldn't have." We sat like that for a while, holding hands in the fading light, neither of us speaking. Finally, Declan looked at me. "When I got your text," he said, "when I read he broke my arm, and I saw the fear in your words, I couldn't walk away. I couldn't let another Omega die, because an Alpha decided they owned them." "You saved my life," I said. "You save your own life. You send that text. You answer the door. You got in my car." He squeezed my hand. "I just helped." "You did more than help." He looked at me for a long moment. His gray eyes were soft in the dim light, warmer than I'd ever seen them. "I'm glad you're here, Eli." "Me too," I whispered. And for the first time in years, I meant it. 3 weeks into my stay, something changed. It started small. A warm flow in my belly that I tried to ignore. A restlessness that made it hard to sit still. A heightened awareness of Declan's scent, the pine and cedar and something darker, earthier, that seemed to cling to everything in the apartment. My heat. It wasn't due for another 2 weeks. My cycles had always been irregular, thrown off by stress and Caleb scent blockers and the suppressants I've been taking since I was 16. But this felt different. Stronger. Like my body was waking up after a long sleep, finally ready to do what it was designed to do. I tried to hide it. I stayed in the guest room, door closed, pretending to work on my laptop while my skin flushed and my temperature rose. I took cold showers. I drank ice water. I told myself it would pass, that it was just a false alarm, that I could get through this without Declan ever knowing. But Omega's and heat smell. And Declan's nose was good. He came home from work on the 4th week, and I watched him freeze in the doorway. Watched his nostrils flare. Watched his gray eyes go dark as my scent hit him, sweet and desperate and wanting. "Eli," he said carefully. "Are you?" "I'm fine." I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to hide the way my body was trembling. "It's nothing. It'll pass." "You're in heat." It wasn't a question. "I can handle it," I said. "I've handled it before. I'll stay in my room. You won't even know I'm here." Declan's jaw tightened. I could see him fighting for control, could smell the way his alpha instincts were screaming at him to do something, to protect, to provide, to claim. But he didn't move. "Have you eaten?" he asked. I blinked. "What?" "Have you eaten today? You need to keep your strength up." He was asking about food. While I stood there in the middle of his living room, flushed and shaking and smelling like every alpha's fantasy, and he was asking if I'd eaten. "No," I admitted. "I couldn't keep anything down this morning." He nodded, like this was perfectly normal, like Omegas went into heat in his apartment every day. "I'll make you soup. Something light. And I'll get you some supplies, water, blankets, whatever you need. You can use my room, it's bigger, and the bed's more comfortable." "Declan, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to." He met my eyes. "I want to." The heat was making it hard to think. Hard to remember why this was a bad idea. Hard to do anything except breathe in his scent and want. Want so badly it hurt. "I should go," I said. "To a hotel or something. I shouldn't be here. I shouldn't. I don't want to make this weird for you." "Eli." He said my name like it was something precious. Something worth protecting. "You're not going anywhere." The words should have terrified me. Caleb had said the same thing, right before he broke my arm. But when Declan said it, it didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like a promise. "You can stay in my room," he said again. "I'll sleep on the couch. I won't come near you unless you ask me to. I won't touch you. I won't," he swallowed. "I won't claim you. Not unless you want me to." My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. "Why are you doing this?" I whispered. "Because you deserve someone who puts you first." He held my gaze. "And I want to be that person. If you'll let me." The heat chose that moment to surge, a wave of warmth so intense it made my knees buckle. Declan caught me, hands on my elbows, steadying gentle, and I leaned into him without meaning to. His chest was solid against my cheek. His arms were warm around my back. His scent wrapped around me like a blanket, and for one perfect moment, everything felt right. "Declan," I breathed. "I've got you," he murmured. "I've got you, Eli. You're safe." He carried me to his room, my room, for the next few days, and lay me down on his bed. The sheets smelled like him. Pine and cedar and something darker, something that made my omega wine with need. "I'll be right outside," he said, backing toward the door. "If you need anything at all, just call. I'll hear you." "Declan." He stopped. "Thank you." He smiled, soft and sad and so gentle. "Always." Then he left, closing the door behind him, and I spent the next 3 days in his bed, surrounded by his scent, listening to him move around the apartment on the other side of the door. He never came in. Not once. But every few hours, he'd knock softly. Ask if I needed water or food or more blankets. Leave supplies outside the door like an offering. And every time I'd press my face into his pillow, breathe in his scent, and feel something I'd never felt with Caleb. Safe. The heat passed on the 4th day. I woke up feeling wrung out but clear-headed, my body finally calm, my mind no longer clouded with want. The sheets were tangled around my legs. Declan's pillow was clutched to my chest. I pressed my face into it one last time, breathing him in, then forced myself to get up. The apartment was quiet. The sun was high in the sky, afternoon, maybe, or early evening. I padded to the bathroom, took the longest shower of my life, and changed into clean clothes that Declan had left outside the door sometime in the past few days. When I finally emerged, he was in the kitchen. He looked up when I walked in, and something in his expression shifted. Relief, maybe. Or worry. "How are you feeling?" "Better," I admitted. "Tired." "Hungry." He nodded and turned back to the stove. "I made stew. Figured you'd need something substantial." I sat at the table and watched him move around the kitchen. He looked tired, dark circles under his eyes, his hair even messier than usual, but he was smiling. "You didn't sleep," I said. "Not much." He shrugged. "Wanted to make sure you were okay. You could have come in." He stilled. "I know," he said quietly, "but I told you I wouldn't." "Not unless you asked." "What if I had?" He turned to look at me. His gray eyes were dark and tense, searching my face for something I wasn't sure I knew how to give. "Eli." His voice was rough. Don't ask me that unless you mean it." "What if I mean it?" The air between us was thick with tension. I could smell my own scent, sweet, hopeful, wanting, mingling with his pine and cedar and something darker. "You're still recovering," he said finally. "Physically. Emotionally. I'm not going to take advantage of that. That's not what this would be." "I know." He moved closer, slow enough that I could pull away if I wanted to. "But I need you to be sure. I need you to want this because you want me, not because you're grateful or scared or—" "Declan." I stood up, crossed the distance between us, reached up and touched his face, his jaw rough with stubble, his skin warm under my fingers. "I want you," I said. "Not because you saved me. Not because I'm grateful. Because you're kind and patient, and you look at me like I matter. Because you make me coffee in the morning, and you don't push me to talk, and you slept on the couch for 3 days while I was in heat in your bed." I stepped closer. "I want you." He stared at me for a long moment. His chest rose and fell with quick, shallow breaths. His scent was overwhelming this close. Pine and cedar and something darker, something that made my omega hindbrain sing. "Eli," he breathed. And then he kissed me. It wasn't gentle. Not this time. This was desperate and hungry and real, his hands cupping my face, his mouth moving against mine like he'd been waiting for this for weeks. Maybe he had. I melted into him. My fingers curled into his shirt, pulling him closer, and when his tongue brushed against my lower lip, I opened for him without hesitation. He tasted like coffee and something sweeter. He smelled like home. Declan, I gasped against his mouth. I've got you, he murmured. I've got you, Eli. I'm not going anywhere. That night we talked. Really talked about everything. About Caleb and the 3 years I'd spent trapped with him. About Lily and the guilt Declan still carried. About the future and what we wanted and whether whatever this was between us, could actually work. I'm scared, I admitted, curled against his chest on the couch. His arm was around my shoulders, his thumb tracing slow circles on my arm. Not of you. Of this. Of wanting something and having it taken away. I'm not going to take anything away from you, Eli. His voice was low and steady. I want to give you things. Choices. Freedom. A life where you don't have to be afraid. That's a lot to promise. I know. He pressed a kiss to my hair. But I mean every word. I tilted my head up to look at him. His gray eyes were soft in the dim light, his expression open in a way I'd never seen before. What if I want more? I asked. What if I want everything? His breath caught. Eli, I'm not asking you to claim me tonight, I said quickly. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. I need you to know. I need you to know that I could see a future with you. A real one. Declan was quiet for a long moment. Then he shifted, turning to face me fully, taking both my hands in his. I'm 34 years old, he said. I've spent my whole life being careful, being practical, doing the smart thing instead of the thing I wanted. He squeezed my hands. I don't want to be careful anymore, Eli. I want you. However you'll have me. For as long as you'll have me. That could be a long time, I whispered. I'm counting on it. He kissed me again, soft this time, sweet, a promise and a prayer all at once, and I let myself believe. For the first time in years, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, I deserved to be happy. The weeks that followed were the best of my life. My arm healed. The cast came off. Physical therapy was brutal, but Declan went with me to every appointment, holding my hand while the therapist made me do exercises that hurt so much I cried. You're doing so good, he'd murmur afterward, pressing kisses to my forehead. I'm so proud of you. And I believed him. I started working again, freelance design, nothing too demanding, but enough to feel useful. Enough to start saving money, to think about what I wanted my life to look like now that I was free. Declan never pushed me to move out. Never made me feel like I was imposing. When I brought it up, tentatively, nervously, he just looked at me with those stormy gray eyes and said, You can stay as long as you want. Forever, if you'll have me. Forever so long time, I said. I'm not going anywhere. We fell into a rhythm that felt almost domestic. Mornings together, coffee and conversation. Evenings on the couch, watching movies or reading, or just being together. Nights tangled up in his bed, my head on his chest, his arms around me, both of us sleeping better than we had in years. I started to feel safe. Really safe. Not the kind of safe that came from hiding or pretending or making myself small. The kind of safe that came from being seen. All of me, the broken parts and the healing parts and the parts that were still figuring out who I was and being loved anyway. Declan loved me. He hadn't said it yet, not in so many words, but I could feel it in the way he touched me, the way he looked at me, the way he made sure I ate and slept and took my medication. He loved me the way you love something precious. Something worth protecting. And I loved him too. So much it scared me sometimes. 2 months after I'd sent that wrong number text, Caleb found me. I was alone in the apartment. Declan had a late meeting, wouldn't be home until after 8, when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I know where you are, Eli. My blood turned to ice. You think that alpha can protect you? He can't. You're mine. You'll always be mine. Another message came through, and then another. I've been watching you. I know about the coffee shop you go to. I know about the park where you sit and read. I know about the physical therapy appointments and the grocery store and the way you smile at him when you think no one's looking. You were supposed to smile at me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. Come home, Eli. Come home and I'll forgive you. We can go back to how things were. I'll take care of you. I'll be good to you. Just come home, before I have to come get you myself. I stared at the messages, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. This was why I couldn't have nice things. This was why I couldn't let myself be happy. Because every time I started to feel safe, Caleb appeared to remind me that I wasn't. That I'd never be. That he'd always be there, waiting, watching, ready to take everything away. I called Declan. He answered on the first ring. Eli, what's wrong? He found me, I whispered. Caleb. He texted me. He knows where I am. He's been watching. There was a pause. When Declan spoke again, his voice was cold in a way I'd never heard before. Don't move. Don't open the door for anyone. I'm on my way. Declan, he said he's going to come get me. He said, Eli. His voice softened. Listen to me. He's not going to touch you. He's not going to get anywhere near you. I won't let him. What if he? I won't let him. The line went quiet. I could hear movement on the other end, keys jangling, a door opening and closing. I'm in a car, Declan said. I'll be there in 15 minutes. Stay on the phone with me. Okay. I curled up on the couch, cradling my phone to my ear, and listened to Declan breathe. Listened to the sounds of the city outside his car windows. Tell me about your day, he said. What did you work on? I swallowed. I finished that logo for the bakery. The one with the croissant. The one you said was giving you trouble? Yeah. I figured it out, though. I made the croissant look like a heart. Subtle. Just a little detail. That sounds beautiful. I'll show you when you get home. I'd like that. We talked about nothing for 12 minutes. About design and food and the book I'd been reading and the plant on the windowsill that had finally started to grow again after I'd accidentally overwatered it. And then Declan was at the door. I'm here, he said through the phone. Can you let me in? I unlocked the door with shaking hands, and he was there, tall and solid and safe, his gray eyes scanning the apartment behind me before settling on my face. Are you okay? He asked. I am now. He pulled me into his arms, and I buried my face in his chest, breathing in his scent. Pine and cedar and something darker. Something that smelled like home. I've got you, he murmured against my hair. I've got you, Eli. You're safe. He knows where we live, I whispered. He's been watching. He said, I know. Declan's arms tightened around me. I saw the messages. What do we do? He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was steady. We go to the police. We file a restraining order. We document everything. He pulled back to look at me. And we don't let him win. What if it's not enough? Then we fight. He cupped my face in his hands. Together. You and me. We fight, Eli. We don't run. I looked into his gray eyes, steady and sure and so certain, and felt something shift inside me. Okay, I said. Together. The police station was cold and fluorescent, and smelled like desperation. We sat in a small room with a beta detective named Harris, who listened to everything. The 3 years of abuse, the broken arm, the threatening messages, with an expression that never changed. Do you have evidence? She asked. Declan handed her my phone. Text messages. Medical records from the ER. Photos of the injury. She scrolled through everything, nodding slowly. This is enough for a restraining order, she said. And likely enough for criminal charges. But I need to warn you, restraining orders are just pieces of paper. They don't physically stop someone from hurting you. I know, I said quietly. Do you have somewhere safe to stay? He's staying with me, Declan said. And he's not leaving. Detective Harris looked between us, and something in her expression softened. Good, she said. Stay together. Stay aware. And if he contacts you again, call me immediately. We filed the paperwork that night. The restraining order was approved the next morning, a temporary one, pending a hearing, and a sheriff's deputy served it to Caleb at his apartment. I wasn't there to see his face when he opened the door, but I wished I had been. The next few weeks were tense. Caleb didn't contact me directly. The restraining order made that illegal, but I could feel him out there, watching, waiting. His presence was a weight on my chest, a shadow at the edge of my vision. I stopped leaving the apartment alone. Declan went with me everywhere, to the grocery store, to physical therapy, to the coffee shop where I like to work. He held my hand in public and kissed my forehead in private, and never once made me feel like a burden. "You're not a burden," he said when I tried to apologize. "You're my partner. This is what partners do." "It's a lot," I said. "You're worth it." The restraining order hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. Long enough for the fear to settle into something manageable. Long enough for me to almost convince myself that everything would be okay. And then Caleb violated the order. It was a Tuesday. Declan was at work. I was alone in the apartment. I finally started to feel safe enough to stay by myself when I heard a knock at the door. Not Declan's knock. Declan had a rhythm, a pattern. This was different. Harder. More insistent. I crept to the door and looked through the peephole. Caleb. He was standing in the hallway, wearing the suit he wore to work, his hair perfectly styled, his expression calm and pleasant like he was just stopping by for a visit. "Eli," he called through the door. "I know you're in there. I can smell you." My heart stopped. "Open the door, baby. Let's talk. Just the two of us." "Go away," I said. My voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. "I can't do that." He leaned against the door frame, casual and confident. "You're my omega. We have things to work out. I'm not your anything." That's not what the bond says. The bond. I'd almost forgotten about it, the incomplete mating bond he'd forced on me 2 years ago, when I'd been too scared and too drugged to say no. It had faded over time, weakened by distance and suppressants, but it was still there. A thread connecting us. A chain I couldn't break. "I can feel you," Caleb said softly. "I can feel how scared you are. How confused. It's okay, baby. I'll take care of you. Just open the door. I'm calling the police." He laughed. "Go ahead. They won't get here in time." I backed away from the door, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. I dialed 911, then Declan, then 911 again when the dispatcher put me on hold. And then I heard the lock click. Caleb had a key. Of course he had a key. He'd had copies made of every apartment we'd ever lived in, just in case. I'd forgotten to change the locks when I moved in with Declan. I'd been so focused on healing, on building something new, that I'd forgotten to protect myself from the past. The door swung open. Caleb stepped inside, smiling. "There you are," he said. "I've been looking everywhere for you." I don't remember much after that. I remember running. I remember him catching me. I remember the way his hands felt on my arms, bruising, crushing, wrong, and the way his scent flooded the apartment, aggressive and angry and terrifying. I remember screaming. I remember Declan's voice, "Eli, Eli," and the sound of the door slamming open, and the weight of Caleb being torn off me. And then there was fighting. Real fighting. The kind I'd only ever seen in movies, fists and teeth and growls. Alpha against alpha, each of them trying to dominate the other. I curled up in the corner of the couch, my arms wrapped around my head, and waited for it to be over. It ended when the police arrived. 3 officers burst into the apartment, guns drawn, and pulled them apart. Caleb was bleeding from a cut above his eye. Declan's lip was split, his knuckles raw, but he was still standing, still protecting me. "Eli," he said, and his voice broke something inside me. "Eli, look at me." I looked up. "Are you okay?" I wasn't. Not really. But he was here, and Caleb was in handcuffs, and somehow impossibly, I was still alive. "I'm okay," I whispered. "I'm okay." He crossed the room and pulled me into his arms, and I buried my face in his chest and breathed. Pine and cedar and something darker. Home. Caleb was arrested for violating the restraining order, breaking and entering, and assault. The district attorney decided to press charges. The restraining order hearing became a criminal trial, and I spent the next 3 months preparing to testify against the alpha who had broken me. Declan was with me every step of the way. He went with me to meetings with the prosecutor. He held my hand when I gave my deposition. He stayed up with me on the nights when the nightmares were too much, when I woke up screaming and drenched in sweat, convinced that Caleb had found me again. "He can't hurt you," Declan would murmur, stroking my hair. "He's in jail. He can't hurt you anymore." "I know," I'd say. "I know." But knowing and believing were two different things. The trial was shorter than I expected. The prosecutor presented our evidence: the medical records, the threatening text, the testimony from Detective Harris and the officers who'd responded to the break-in. Declan testified about the night he'd received my text, about finding me on my kitchen floor with a broken arm, about everything that had happened since. And then it was my turn. I walked to the witness stand, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Declan was in the gallery, watching me with those stormy gray eyes, and somehow that made it easier. "Mr. Chen," the prosecutor said, "can you tell the court what happened on the day you texted Mr. Vance by accident?" I took a deep breath. "I told my ex-boyfriend I was leaving him," I said, "and he broke my arm." The testimony took 2 hours. I told him everything: the 3 years of abuse, the isolation, the control, the fear. I told him about the incomplete mating bond Caleb had forced on me. I told him about the night he'd broken into Declan's apartment and tried to take me back. When I finished, the courtroom was silent. Caleb's lawyer tried to cross-examine me, tried to paint me as unstable, vindictive, unreliable. But I held my ground. I looked him in the eye and told the truth, and by the time he sat down, even he looked like he didn't believe his own client. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. "We find the defendant guilty on all counts." I collapsed against Declan, tears streaming down my face, and he held me while the judge read the sentence: 5 years in prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. A permanent restraining order, mandated anger management, and alpha sensitivity training. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough to undo what he'd done to me. But it was something. It was justice. That night, Declan and I sat on his couch, our couch now, in comfortable silence. My arm had healed. The cast was gone, replaced by a faint ache that the doctors said would fade with time. The bruises had faded. The nightmares came less often. I was healing. "What are you thinking about?" Declan asked. "That I almost didn't send that text," I said. "That I almost typed the right number. That if I had, but you didn't." He pulled me closer. "You sent it to me. Lucky me. Lucky me," he corrected. I looked up at him. His gray eyes were soft, warm, full of something I was finally learning to recognize. "Love?" "Declan," I said. "Yeah. I want you to claim me." He went very still. "Eli." "I'm sure," I said. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life. You've been through so much. I don't want you to feel like you have to. I don't feel like I have to." I reached up and touched his face. "I feel like I want to. I want to be yours, Declan. Not because I belong to you. Because I choose you. Every day, for the rest of my life, I choose you." His eyes glistened. "Eli." "Claim me," I whispered. "Please." He kissed me then, soft and sweet and full of promise, and when he pulled back, his eyes were darker than I'd ever seen them. "I love you," he said. "I've loved you since the moment I read your text. Since the moment I saw you on that floor, broken and scared and still fighting. I love you too. You're sure. I've never been more sure of anything." He carried me to his bedroom, our bedroom, and laid me down on the bed. The sheets smelled like him. Pine and cedar and something darker. "This is going to hurt," he warned. "Just for a moment." "I know. And then it's forever." "Good." I pulled him closer. "I want forever." He leaned down and pressed his lips to the spot where my neck met my shoulder. The spot where his bite would go. The spot where he'd mark me as his, and I'd mark him as mine. I love you, he said again. I love you too. And when he bit down, when his teeth broke my skin and his scent flooded my senses and the bond snapped into place between us, I didn't feel trapped. I felt free. Epilogue. 1 year later. The cabin was small but sturdy, nestled deep in the woods, with a porch that faced the mountains and a garden out back where we grew vegetables and flowers. Declan had bought it after the trial, a place we could escape to when the city felt too heavy. A place that was just ours. We spent our first anniversary there. The autumn leaves were turning red and gold and orange, and the air smelled like wood smoke and pine. I was sitting on the porch swaying, a blanket over my lap, watching the sun set over the mountains. Declan came out with 2 mugs of tea and sat down beside me. What are you thinking about? He asked. How lucky I am, I said. How I almost didn't get this. But you did. Because of a wrong number. I smiled. Because I couldn't see straight, and I typed the wrong digits, and I sent my cry for help to a stranger. Not a stranger, he corrected. Me. You. He put his arm around me, and I leaned into him, breathing in his scent. Pine and cedar and something darker. Something that smelled like home. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you'd sent it to the right person? He asked. Sometimes. I tilted my head to look at him. But then I stopped. Because it doesn't matter. This is what happened. This is where I ended up. And where's that? Home. He kissed me, soft and sweet and full of promise, and I felt the bond pulse between us warm and steady and right. I've been broken once. Shattered by an alpha who thought he owned me, who thought he could break my bones and my spirit and my will to live. But in the breaking, I'd found something I never expected. I'd found Declan. And Declan had held the pieces while I figured out how to fit them back together. He'd been patient when I couldn't trust. Gentle when I couldn't stop flinching. Strong when I couldn't find my own strength. He'd loved me when I couldn't love myself. And now, sitting on the porch of our cabin, watching the sun set over the mountains with my mate's arm around me and our bond humming between us, I realized something important. The wrong number hadn't been a mistake. It had been fate. Then,